The termination email arrived at 11:47 p.m., 3 minutes after my father's heart monitor went silent. I didn't cry. I stared at the blue glow of my phone screen, the hospital corridor's fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like trapped insects. The subject line read, "Effective immediately." My father's hand was still warm in mine. 6 months earlier, Von Mercer had stood at the head of the conference table, his smile sharp as polished glass, and said the words that would ruin me. "Family comes first. Always." The marketing team nodded. I believed him. I wanted to. What I didn't know then, what none of us knew, was that Von Mercer didn't have a family. He had assets. And I was about to become disposable. The glass-walled conference room overlooked Peachtree Street, all chrome and ambition. Von paced slowly, his Italian loafers soundless on the carpet, his voice warm as Sunday morning. "This company," he said, pausing for effect, "isn't built on quarterly reports. It's built on loyalty, on sacrifice, on family." I watched him from the third chair, my coffee cooling in my hands. I was 48, a marketing director who'd climbed every rung without a safety net. My father had raised me alone after my mother died when I was 12. I knew sacrifice. I knew loyalty. Von's eyes swept the room, landing on me for just a heartbeat longer than the others. "When you're here," he continued, "you're not employees. You're family. And family doesn't let each other down." The room murmured agreement. I felt my chest tighten, not with pride but with something I couldn't name yet. A warning my body understood before my mind did. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I didn't check it. Vaughn smiled wider. "That's why I know, no matter what life throws at us, we'll always show up for each other. Right, Elise?" My name in his mouth felt like a trap snapping shut. "Right," I said softly. The meeting ended. People filtered out, laughing, caffeinated, alive. I stayed behind, pulling out my phone. 7 missed calls. All from Atlanta General Hospital. On my desk, untouched for 3 days, sat a manila envelope. My father's name written in his own shaky handwriting across the front. Dad's insurance policy. I hadn't opened it. There was always tomorrow. Always time. The phone buzzed again. This time I answered. "Miss Harper." The nurse's voice was gentle, practiced. "You need to come. Now." I looked through the glass wall. Vaughn was still in the hallway, shaking hands, radiating warmth. I grabbed my bag. I didn't know it yet, but I'd just made the choice that would cost me everything, and give me back my life. My father's doctor finally called. "You need to come. Now." But Vaughn's eyes were already on me, watching, waiting to see if I'd choose family, or his version of it. I made it to Atlanta General in 23 minutes. The speed limit was a suggestion I no longer cared about. The corridor smelled like antiseptic and something else. Something final. My heels clicked too loud against the linoleum. A nurse looked up, recognized the panic in my face and pointed without a word. "Room 304. My father was smaller than I remembered. The hospital bed swallowed him whole, tubes snaking from his arms like vines reclaiming abandoned ground. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow and mechanical. "Dad," I whispered, pulling the chair close. "I'm here. I'm sorry I'm late." His hand twitched. I grabbed it, holding tight. The memories hit me sideways. Flashes of a different life. Me at 16, working the night shift at a diner while he worked days at the auto shop. Both of us so tired we'd fall asleep at the kitchen table, my homework spread between coffee cups and his grease-stained work orders. He never complained. Not once. "You made it," he rasped, eyes fluttering open. His voice was gravel and relief. "Of course I did." His grip tightened weakly. "Don't let them own you, Elise. Whatever job it is, don't let them own you." I wanted to tell him he was wrong. That Vaughn was different. That this company valued me. But the words stuck in my throat like broken glass. My phone buzzed. I ignored it. It buzzed again. And again. Finally, I glanced down. Vaughn's name lit up the screen. We need you for tomorrow's client pitch. 9 a.m. sharp. This is critical. I stared at the message, then at my father's face. His eyes drifting closed again, exhausted from just those few words. I'll be right back, I lied, stepping into the hallway. I called Vaughn. He answered on the first ring, his voice bright and unbothered. Elise. Good. Listen, the Brennan account is heating up and we need your touch tomorrow. I know it's last minute, but... My father's in the hospital, I interrupted. It's serious. Silence. Not the empathetic kind. The calculating kind. I'm sorry to hear that, he said finally, his tone flattening. But Elise, this pitch could make or break the quarter. Surely you can. I don't know how long I'll need to be here. Another pause. Longer this time. Let me be clear, Vaughn said, his warmth evaporating like steam. If you're not at that pitch tomorrow, you're signaling to the team and to me that you're not committed. And we can't afford passengers right now. The fluorescent lights buzzed louder. Or maybe that was just the ringing in my ears. Are you saying? I'm saying we're a family here, Elise. And family shows up. He hung up. I stood there, phone pressed to my ear, listening to dead air. Back in the room, my father had drifted into a fitful sleep. I sat beside him, holding his hand, my mind spinning through impossible calculations. If I left now, I could prep the pitch overnight. Be there at 9. Prove my loyalty. If I stayed, my father wouldn't be alone. Not tonight. A nurse stopped by to check vitals. She saw my face and softened. You should stay, she said gently. He knows you're here. That matters. I nodded, but my hand was already reaching for my laptop bag. The next morning, I walked into that pitch meeting with my father's hospital bracelet still on my wrist, hidden under my sleeve. My presentation was flawless. Vaughn congratulated me in front of everyone, his hand on my shoulder like a blessing. See, he said, smiling. That's what commitment looks like. I smiled back. My face felt like cracked porcelain. At lunch, my coworker Tessa pulled me aside in the break room, her voice low. You know he's been telling people you're slipping, right? My stomach dropped. What? He said it last week in the leadership meeting. That you've been distracted. Unreliable. She glanced toward Vaughn's office. I just thought you should know. I stared at my coffee, watching the steam rise and disappear. That night, I went back to the hospital. My father squeezed my hand when I walked in and I lied to his face. Work's been so understanding, I said, my voice bright and hollow. They told me to take all the time I need. He smiled, relieved. Good. That's good, sweetheart. I held his hand and felt the trap tighten around both of us. 3 days later, Vaughn called me into his office. The view behind him was postcard perfect. Atlanta's skyline glittering under October sun. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, looking like a man who'd never missed a night's sleep. Elise, he said warmly. I wanted to personally thank you for pushing through last week. That kind of dedication doesn't go unnoticed. I forced a smile. Thank you. In fact, he continued, pulling out a folder, I've been reviewing your performance. You're up for a senior director role. But, he paused, letting the word hang between us like a blade. I need to know you're all in. 110%. My heart hammered. Senior director. The promotion I'd been chasing for 3 years. I am, I said. Good. He slid a document across the desk. Because we have the Caldwell merger coming up. Next 2 weeks are going to be brutal. Late nights, weekend calls, full immersion. If you can be a team player through this, the promotion's yours. I looked down at the document. My reflection stared back from the polished wood, distorted and unfamiliar. I understand, I said. He smiled. I knew I could count on you. I left his office feeling like I'd signed something in blood. That night, I was at my father's bedside when the memory hit me, sudden and sharp as breaking glass. I was 8 years old, sitting on the kitchen floor by candlelight because the power had been shut off again. My father was at the table repairing someone's carburetor by lamplight, his hands black with grease. I was doing homework on a notebook he'd bought with spare change. "Why do you work so much?" I'd asked. He'd looked up, his face tired but gentle. "Because you deserve a future, baby girl. And futures don't come cheap." He'd worked himself to exhaustion for me. And now I was doing the same, but for strangers who called themselves family. My phone buzzed. A message from Vaughn. "Need you on a call in 20. Caldwell's legal team has questions." I looked at my father, his breathing labored, machines beeping their steady countdown. I typed back, "I'll be there." The call lasted 2 hours. When it ended, I drove back to the hospital. The night shift nurse met me at the door, her face a mask of practiced sympathy. "Miss Harper," she said softly, "your father's condition has worsened. His heart is failing. You should stay close." Time collapsed. Hours blurred into a single, suffocating present. I held his hand. I told him I loved him. I promised him things I'd already broken. At 2:47 a.m. his heart monitor flatlined. The sound was so ordinary, a long single note that meant everything had ended. I sat there, frozen, his hand still warm in mine. My phone buzzed. I looked down, numb. An email from HR. Sent at 2:44 a.m., 3 minutes before my father's death. Subject: termination of employment, effective immediately. "Ms. Harper, due to recent performance concerns and your inability to maintain professional commitments during critical business periods, we are terminating your employment effective immediately. Please return all company property by end of business Monday. Sincerely, HR Department." I read it twice. Then a third time. The nurse was talking, saying something about forms and next steps, but I couldn't hear her over the roaring in my ears. I looked at the email timestamp again. 2:44 a.m. Vaughn had fired me while my father was dying. I sat there in that antiseptic room holding my father's cooling hand, staring at the blue glow of my phone. And something inside me, something that had bent, and bent, and bent, for years, finally snapped clean. The funeral was on a Thursday. Rain drummed against the church hall's tin roof like impatient fingers. 17 people showed up. Neighbors mostly. A few of my father's old co-workers from the auto shop, their faces weathered and kind. The pastor who'd never met him but spoke in generous platitudes. No one from my office came, but they sent flowers. A massive arrangement of lilies and roses with a card that read, "Our deepest condolences. The team at Mercer and Associates." I stared at it for a long time, that bouquet of expensive guilt. The next morning I opened LinkedIn and saw Vaughn's post, uploaded the day of the funeral. Heartbroken to hear about the loss of our colleague Elise Harper's father. Family is everything. Our thoughts are with her during this difficult time. Folded hands, blue heart. 342 likes. Dozens of comments praising his compassion. I closed the app before I threw my phone through the wall. 2 days later I received a package from the office. My personal items, a coffee mug, a framed photo of my father, some notebooks, all packed with the care of someone cleaning out a crime scene. And buried at the bottom, a letter on company letterhead. "Ms. Harper, after review, we've determined that your recent performance issues and unreliable attendance during critical business periods left us no choice but to terminate your position. Your departure was due to failure to meet professional obligations during a time-sensitive project." It was signed by Vaughn. I read it 3 times, each word sharper than the last. He'd rewritten history. Erased my father's death. Turned my grief into professional failure. And then I saw the second page, an internal memo accidentally included. To Senior Leadership Elise Harper termination. Due to emotional instability and unreliable behavior under stress, we've reassigned her clients to Tessa Grant and consolidated her role. This restructuring will improve team efficiency and reduce liability concerns related to Ms. Harper's recent performance. Liability concerns. Emotional instability. He'd poisoned the well. Made sure I'd never work in this industry again. I sat at my kitchen table, the letter in my hands, and felt something cold settle in my chest where rage used to burn. Then I remembered the envelope. My father's envelope, still sitting unopened on my counter. I'd been avoiding it, afraid of what final words he'd left me. I opened it slowly. Inside was a single sheet of paper, his handwriting shaky but clear. Elise, this insurance policy isn't for them. It's for you to walk away clean. Don't give your life to people who wouldn't give you a minute. I worked myself to the bone so you wouldn't have to. Don't waste that gift. Love, Dad. Beneath the note was the policy, $250,000. Enough to survive. Enough to breathe. Enough to fight back. I folded the letter carefully, pressing it flat against my heart. For the first time since my father died, I felt something other than grief. I felt clarity. 6 weeks later, Vaughn Mercer won Ethical Leader of the Year at the Atlanta Business Summit. I watched the live stream from my apartment, a glass of wine in my hand, my father's letter folded in my pocket. Vaughn stood on stage in a tailored suit, holding a crystal award that caught the light like a promise. His speech was flawless, all humility and inspiration. Leadership isn't about profit margins, he said, his voice filling the ballroom. It's about people. About creating a culture where everyone feels valued, supported, and heard. The audience applauded. I took a long sip of wine. At Mercer and Associates, he continued, we don't just talk about family values. We live them. Every day. More applause. Someone whistled. I set down my wine and picked up my phone. It was time to make a call. But first I scrolled through the summit's event page. There in the sponsor section I saw it. Caldwell Industries, Platinum Sponsor. The same company whose merger I'd worked myself to exhaustion for. The same company Vaughn had used as an excuse to fire me. I clicked through to their leadership page and found a name. Lila Mercer, VP of Operations. Vaughn's wife. I stared at her photo. Sharp eyes, controlled smile. The look of a woman who knew exactly where the bodies were buried. Then I noticed something else. In the background of Vaughn's acceptance photo, barely visible in the crowd, was Tessa. My former co-worker. Wearing a Mercer and Associates name badge with a new title. Senior Director of Marketing. My old position. The one Vaughn had promised me. I took a screenshot. Then another. Then I opened a new browser tab and started searching. By midnight I had 3 things. A list of every client Vaughn had reassigned from me to Tessa. A record of the company restructuring announcement, posted the same week my father died. And an email address for Lila Mercer's executive assistant. I drafted a message, deleted it, drafted again. Finally I wrote, Ms. Mercer, my name is Elise Harper. I worked under your husband for 6 years. There are some financial discrepancies related to the Caldwell merger that I believe you should be aware of. Would you be available for a brief conversation? Best regards, Elise. I hovered over the send button for a long time. Then I thought about my father working himself to the bone in that dim garage. About his final words. Don't let them own you. I hit send. The reply came 3 hours later. Ms. Harper, let's talk. Tomorrow 10 a.m. My office. Come alone. Lila. I smiled for the first time in 2 months. The scales hadn't fallen yet. But they were starting to crack. Lila Mercer's office wasn't what I expected. I'd imagined cold glass and steel, the kind of corporate fortress that screamed power. Instead it was warm, wood paneling, soft lighting, a Persian rug that probably cost more than my father's funeral. Family photos lined the credenza behind her desk. Vaughn's face smiled from every frame, frozen in manufactured joy. Lila herself was smaller than her LinkedIn photo suggested, but her presence filled the room like pressure before a storm. She wore a cream blouse and pearl earrings, her dark hair pulled back so tight it looked painful. Miss Harper. She gestured to the chair across from her. Please sit. I sat, my father's letter folded in my purse like a talisman. Thank you for meeting with me, I began. She held up one hand, silencing me with a gesture so practiced it must have ended 1,000 conversations. Before you say anything, she said, her voice measured and cool, I want you to know something. I've been married to Vaughn for 18 years. I know exactly who he is. The question is, do you? The air left my lungs. She leaned back, studying me with eyes that missed nothing. You worked under him for 6 years. You were fired the night your father died. And now you're here in my office talking about financial discrepancies. She paused. So let me ask you directly, Elise, are you here for justice or revenge? I opened my mouth, closed it. The truth lodged in my throat like a stone. I don't know, I admitted finally. Maybe both. For the first time Lila smiled. It wasn't warm. It was recognition. Good, she said. Because I need someone who wants both. She opened a drawer and pulled out a folder. Thick, worn at the edges, the kind of file that's been handled obsessively. She slid it across the desk. Open it. Inside were financial documents, emails, bank statements. All marked with Vaughn's signature. All showing the same pattern. Inflated invoices, phantom consulting fees, money siphoned from client accounts into offshore holdings. My hands trembled as I flipped through page after page. How long have you known? I whispered. 2 years. Lila's voice was flat, emotionless. I've been gathering evidence, building a case, waiting for the right moment. I looked up at her, this woman in pearls and perfect composure, and saw something I recognized. The kind of rage that's been buried so deep it's fossilized into patience. Why are you showing me this? Because I need a witness, she said simply. Someone who worked inside his operation. Someone he destroyed. Her eyes locked onto mine. Someone with nothing left to lose. The weight of it settled over me like a shroud. What do you want me to do? Lila leaned forward, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. I want you to help me take everything from him. The company, the reputation, the awards, the illusion of the man he pretends to be. She paused. And in return, I'll make sure the world knows exactly what he did to you. I thought about my father's final words. About Vaughn's hand on my shoulder, congratulating me for sacrificing everything. About that termination email sent while my father's heart gave out. When do we start? I asked. Lila smiled again, and this time it reached her eyes. We already have. The envelope arrived 3 days later. Plain manila, no return address, delivered to my apartment by courier. Inside was a single USB drive and a handwritten note in Lila's precise script. Listen to this. Then call me. I plugged it into my laptop, hands shaking. The audio file was labeled Board Meeting March 15th. 2 months before my father died. I pressed play. Vaughn's voice filled my apartment, warm and confident, addressing what sounded like the senior leadership team. He spoke about performance concerns, about my reliability, about worries regarding my mental state. The words floated through my speakers like poison. Measured, clinical, devastating. He mentioned documenting everything, creating a paper trail for eventual termination. Legal protection. Someone questioned the timing, suggested my strong track record deserved consideration. But Vaughn's response was immediate and certain. I was already a liability, just a matter of when, not if. The recording ended. I sat in the silence of my apartment, my father's framed photo staring at me from the bookshelf. He'd been alive when that meeting happened. I'd been working 60-hour weeks, believing I was earning a promotion. Skipping lunches to meet deadlines. Responding to emails at midnight. Proving my worth. But Vaughn had already decided I was disposable. 2 months before my father's death, he'd started building the case to destroy me. Every late arrival I'd apologized for. Documented. Every project deadline I'd barely met while caring for my father, noted as barely acceptable. Every moment of my humanity had been weaponized against me while I believed I was part of a family. I thought about the nights I'd stayed late, the weekends I'd sacrificed, the birthday dinners with my father I'd rescheduled because the team needed me. All of it had been meaningless. I'd been performing for an audience that had already written my ending. My hands trembled as I replayed the file. Vaughn's voice was so smooth, so reasonable, so concerned. He'd painted me as unstable, emotional, unreliable, all while I'd been drowning trying to keep my father alive and my career intact. The manipulation was surgical. He'd made my destruction sound like mercy. I called Lila. She answered immediately, her voice cutting through my spiral. She confirmed what I'd just heard. Vaughn had done this before. Found someone loyal, worked them to exhaustion, then discarded them before they could become a threat. I was the fourth person in 6 years. The pattern was so clean it could have been a business model. I thought about Tessa sitting at my old desk with her new title, believing she'd earned it through merit. How long before Vaughn turned on her too? 6 months? A year? How long before she became the fifth casualty of his systematic cruelty? Then Lila told me what she needed. Something that made my stomach turn, that felt impossible, that required me to become smaller than I'd ever been. She needed me to go back. To see Vaughn. To apologize. To beg for my job back. To make him believe I was broken. The request hit me like a physical blow. After everything, the termination, the lies, the calculated destruction of my reputation, she wanted me to crawl back and pretend it was my fault. But she explained the psychology of it. Arrogant men needed confession. They couldn't resist someone crawling back, validating their worldview, confirming their superiority. And when Vaughn gloated, when he explained exactly what he thought of me, when his ego demanded he make me understand how clever he'd been, I needed to record every word. I closed my eyes, my father's letter burning against my heart like a brand. The insurance money sitting in my account wasn't just survival funds. It was freedom. The freedom to walk away. The freedom to never see Vaughn Mercer's face again. But it was also the freedom to fight back. I thought about my father working until his hands bled so I could have a future. About the nights he'd fallen asleep at the kitchen table, too exhausted to make it to bed. About his final words, begging me not to let them own me. This wasn't about Vaughn owning me. This was about making sure he never owned anyone again. I took a shaking breath and agreed. My voice barely whispered the word, but it was enough. Lila's response was immediate. Not quite approval, but recognition. She understood what this cost. And she promised that when it was over, Vaughn Mercer would never hurt another person the way he'd hurt me. I hung up and sat in the silence of my apartment, staring at my reflection in the darkened laptop screen. Tomorrow I would walk back into that building. I would smile at the man who destroyed me. I would apologize for my own destruction. And I would record every moment of his victory. Because the scales were falling. And he didn't even know it yet. The office building looked the same. Same glass doors, same marble lobby, same security guard who'd smiled at me every morning for 6 years. He didn't recognize me now. I'd asked Vaughn's assistant for a meeting through a carefully worded email that suggested humility and desperation. She'd responded within an hour, her tone professionally cold, offering Thursday at 4 p.m. Now it was Thursday. 3:58 p.m. My phone was in my jacket pocket, recording app already running. Lila had walked me through it twice. How to position myself, how to keep him talking, how to let his ego do the work. Men like Vaughn needed to explain themselves. They needed you to understand how clever they were, how justified their cruelty had been. Give him that stage, she'd said. Let him perform. The elevator ride to the 7th floor felt like descending into water. Pressure building, sound distorting, reality bending. My reflection in the polished steel doors looked like a stranger. Composed. Professional. Broken in exactly the way Vaughn would expect. The doors opened. Tessa was at my old desk, typing on my old computer, drinking from a mug I'd left behind. She glanced up and for a moment something flickered across her face. Guilt maybe. Or satisfaction. Or perhaps just the uncomfortable recognition of a ghost returning to haunt the space she'd inherited. I walked past her without speaking, past the conference room where Vaughn had promised we were family, past the coffee station where I'd spent so many mornings preparing for battles I didn't know I was losing. Every step felt like walking through my own funeral, revisiting a life that had died months ago. His office door was open. Vaughn stood, arms open in a gesture of welcome that made my skin crawl. He closed the door behind me, the soft click of the latch sounding final. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. The same chair where he'd promised me that promotion, where he'd congratulated me for sacrificing my father's final hours for a client pitch. He asked how I was holding up, his expression carefully sympathetic. The performance was flawless. If I hadn't heard that recording, hadn't known he'd been planning my destruction for months, I might have believed the concern in his voice was real. I took a breath, steadying myself for what came next. I apologized. The words tasted like poison, each one scraping my throat raw. I told him I'd let my personal life interfere with work, that I hadn't been there when the team needed me, that he'd been right about me not being a team player. I forced the words out, made my voice small, desperate, exactly what he needed to hear. Something shifted in his face. A flash of satisfaction he couldn't quite hide. A flicker of triumph that confirmed everything I'd suspected. This was what he'd wanted all along. My confession. My acknowledgement that he'd been right to destroy me. Then I told him I wanted to come back. That I wanted my job back. That I knew I'd messed up but could do better. I leaned forward, made myself smaller, begged. The word please hung in the air between us like surrender. The silence that followed felt like a physical presence in the room. Then Vaughn leaned back in his chair, steepled his fingers and smiled. That smile told me everything. He'd won, I'd lost, and he was about to explain exactly why that had always been inevitable. He spoke about my dedication, acknowledging I'd shown up even when struggling. But the team had moved on. Tessa was doing excellent work. The organization was stronger without my instability. The word hung between us like an accusation. Instability. As if grief was a character flaw. As if loving my father enough to be present for his death was a professional failing. I repeated the word back to him, let it settle, let him hear how it sounded. He softened his tone immediately, claiming he didn't mean it harshly. But people who became unreliable, who let emotions cloud their judgment, they affected everyone. The company couldn't risk that anymore. Business decision, he said. Nothing personal. I mentioned the timing. The fact that he'd fired me the night my father died. His face didn't change. Not even a flicker of shame or recognition. The timing had been unfortunate, he explained, but I'd already been struggling for months. Emotional outbursts. Missed deadlines. Shutting down when receiving feedback. He tried to help, given me chances, but I simply couldn't handle the pressure. The lies were so smooth, so practiced, I wondered how many times he'd told this story. How many other people he'd erased with this same script. Then I asked about the board meeting. About him telling them I was mentally unstable. His head tilted, studying me with something like curiosity. He'd simply told them the truth, he said. That I was struggling. That I needed help. He'd been trying to protect me from myself. The recording app in my pocket was capturing every word, every pause, every perfectly crafted lie that rewrote history and painted my humanity as weakness. I asked if there was any chance of returning, already knowing the answer. His smile was almost pitying. Time for me to move forward, he said. Find something new. Something less demanding. The condescension in his voice was so thick I could taste it. I stood slowly, my legs steady despite the rage burning through my veins like wildfire. Before leaving, I paused at the door. One more question, I said. That promotion he'd promised me, the one he'd given to Tessa. When had he decided I wasn't getting it? His smile faltered just for a heartbeat. He claimed not to recall promising anything definite. But I gave him the date. March 15th. 2 months before my father died. He'd already written me off, already decided I was disposable, already started building the paper trail to justify my termination. His face went very still. The mask slipped for just a moment and I saw something underneath. Not guilt, but irritation that I'd discovered his timeline. He declared the conversation over. I agreed, thanked him for his time with perfect professionalism and walked out. Past Tessa. Past my old desk. Past the ghost of who I used to be. In the elevator, I pulled out my phone and stopped the recording. 43 minutes of Vaughn Mercer explaining exactly how clever he'd been, how justified, how right. 43 minutes of him confessing to calculated cruelty while believing he was simply stating facts. I sent it to Lila with a single message. Her response came immediately. Perfect, now we wait. The elevator doors opened. I stepped out into the lobby, into the Atlanta evening, into the rest of my life. My hands were steady. My breathing was calm. Something had shifted inside me during that meeting, something fundamental and irreversible. I'd gone into that office prepared to feel small. But sitting across from Vaughn, watching him perform his practiced compassion, hearing him rewrite my pain as professional failure, I'd felt something unexpected. Power. Not the loud kind. Not the aggressive kind. The quiet kind that comes from knowing exactly who you're dealing with and having the patience to let them destroy themselves. Behind me, Vaughn Mercer sat in his corner office, surrounded by his trophies and his lies, completely unaware that his empire had just started crumbling. The recording on my phone was time-stamped, backed up, and saved in 3 different locations. And somewhere in the city, Lila Mercer was listening to it, adding it to a file that had been growing for 2 years, building a case so airtight that when it finally closed, there would be no escape. I walked to my car, got in, and sat in the silence for a long moment. Then I smiled. Not from joy. From recognition. My father had been right. They couldn't own me. Not anymore. I'd just proven it. 3 weeks later, I got the invitation. Mercer and Associates Annual Client Appreciation Gala. Black tie. The Four Seasons Ballroom. The kind of event where Vaughn would shine. Working the room, collecting admiration like currency, cementing relationships that would keep his machine running for another year. The invitation was addressed to Ms. Elise Harper, guest of Mrs. Lila Mercer. I stared at it for a long time, the embossed lettering catching the light like a promise or a threat. My phone rang moments later. Lila's voice was calm when I answered, explaining why I needed to be there. Vaughn needed to see that I wasn't broken. More importantly, she was announcing the new board structure that night, and she wanted me to watch his face when he realized what was happening. A reorganization, she called it. Years of cooking the books, moving money through ghost consulting contracts, all meticulously documented. Board members were already aligned. Tomorrow night, she'd propose a full financial audit and temporary suspension of his operational authority pending investigation. He would fight it, I said. He agreed he'd try. But she had the votes. And more importantly, she had me. The employee he'd destroyed while her father was dying. The perfect face for his cruelty. Eventually, she'd need me to testify when this went public, when they filed with the State Ethics Board and Business Licensing Commission. I looked at my father's photo on the mantel, his kind eyes staring back at me, and told her I'd be there. The gala was exactly what I expected. Too much champagne, too many forced smiles, too much wealth pretending to be warmth. Crystal chandeliers cast fractured light across tables draped in white linen. String quartet in the corner playing something classical and forgettable. Laughter that sounded more like performance than joy. I wore a black dress Lila had sent over, simple and elegant, the kind of armor that said I don't need your approval anymore. No jewelry except my father's watch, the one he'd worn every day of his working life. The leather band was cracked, the face scratched, but it kept perfect time. Vaughn saw me the moment I walked in. His face flickered, surprise, confusion, then a carefully constructed mask of pleasant indifference. He stood across the room with a cluster of clients, Tessa at his elbow playing the perfect protégé, nodding at appropriate moments, laughing at his jokes with practiced enthusiasm. I took a glass of champagne from a passing waiter and found Lila near the silent auction tables. She looked regal in deep burgundy, diamonds at her throat, every inch the executive's wife who'd stood beside her husband for 18 years of perfectly orchestrated events just like this one. She acknowledged my arrival with a subtle nod, confirming that Vaughn had been watching me since I walked in, trying to calculate why I was here, what my presence meant. Let him wonder, I said. Let him spin theories. Let the uncertainty eat at him. The evening moved in slow motion. Courses served with too much ceremony, speeches delivered with too much self-congratulation, wine flowing like conversation. I sat at Lila's table, surrounded by board members I'd never met, people who asked polite questions about what I was doing now, their curiosity barely masked by professional courtesy. I told them I was consulting, taking time to heal, moving forward. All true. All carefully edited to reveal nothing and imply everything. Between the main course and dessert, Vaughn approached our table. He kissed Lila's cheek, complimented the beautiful event, played the devoted husband with practiced ease. His eyes slid to me, commenting on the surprise of my presence. Lila had been kind enough to invite me, I said simply. He smiled that perfect smile, telling me it was good to see me looking well, that he'd been worried about me. The lie hung between us like smoke from a candle just extinguished, visible for a moment then gone, but the smell lingered. Dr. Chin, a board member with sharp eyes, leaned forward asking if I'd worked at Mercer and Associates. I confirmed 6 years of employment. Vaughn jumped in smoothly, calling me one of their best, explaining that personal circumstances had made it difficult for me to continue, that we'd parted on good terms. I let the silence hang for just a beat before speaking. That wasn't quite how I remembered it, I said quietly. The table went still. Conversations at nearby tables continued, but our little corner of the ballroom had frozen, caught in a moment of tension that everyone felt but no one could quite name. Vaughn spoke about perspectives on difficult situations, about how everyone views events through their own lens. True, I agreed, taking a sip of champagne, though some perspectives were more accurate than others. Lila touched my hand, a gentle warning, but I saw the ghost of approval in her face. Vaughn excused himself, returning to his table with Tessa, who looked between us with growing confusion, sensing the undercurrents but unable to read them. Dr. Chin spoke first after he left, her voice dry with observation. That had been interesting. Lila raised her glass in agreement, promising it was about to get more interesting. After dessert, Lila took the stage. The room quieted gradually, conversations trailing off as people turned toward the woman who'd stood in Vaughn Mercer's shadow for 18 years. Always supporting, always smiling, always playing her role to perfection. She thanked everyone for being here, acknowledged the company's tremendous growth, credited clients and partners and team members. Polite applause rippled through the room like water. Then her tone shifted, subtle but unmistakable. Growth required accountability. Accountability required transparency. The energy in the room changed, a collective holding of breath, a sense that something was happening but no one knew quite what. Vaughn sat frozen at his table, smile still in place, but his hand had tightened around his glass hard enough that his knuckles went white. Lila announced that the board had approved a comprehensive financial audit of all company operations. Independent firm. Ethics committee oversight. Full cooperation from all leadership required. She found Vaughn's eyes across the room, repeating the words with pointed emphasis. Full cooperation. He stood, his voice warm but somehow hollow, welcoming transparency and the audit completely. The words were right, but his face had gone pale, the color draining like water from a cracked basin. Lila smiled, thanking him for his support. After all, she said, letting the pause stretch, family came first. Wasn't that what he always said? The room erupted in applause, but underneath it I heard something else. The first whisper of doubt, the initial crack in a dam that had been holding back questions for years. People were clapping, but they were also glancing at each other, wondering what they'd just witnessed, sensing that something significant had shifted but unable to articulate exactly what. Vaughn's eyes found mine across the crowded ballroom. For the first time since I'd known him, through 6 years of working under him, through all his speeches about family and loyalty, through my father's death and my own destruction, I saw something new in his face. Fear. Not the obvious kind. Not panic, but the cold recognition that he'd miscalculated, that pieces were moving on a board he thought he controlled, that the game he'd been playing for years had suddenly changed rules. I raised my glass in a silent toast, the champagne catching the light from the chandeliers above. He looked away first. Around us the gala continued. Dessert being served, coffee poured, more speeches about success and growth and the bright future ahead. But something fundamental had shifted. The foundation of Von Mercer's empire, built on manipulation and carefully constructed lies, had just developed its first visible crack. And everyone in that ballroom had seen it, even if they didn't understand what they were seeing yet. I set down my glass and looked at Lila. She met my eyes across the table and nodded once. A simple gesture that said everything. Phase 1 was complete. The audit was announced. The board was aligned. The evidence was compiled. Now we waited for the structure to collapse under its own weight. I thought about my father in those final moments, his hand in mine, telling me not to let them own me. I thought about Vaughn's termination email sent while my father's heart was failing. I thought about every lie, every manipulation, every moment I'd been made to feel small and unstable and wrong for being human. The scales were falling. And Von Mercer could feel them dropping, one by one, like dominoes he'd carefully arranged without realizing they were pointed back at him. The gala ended an hour later. People filtered out into the Atlanta night, conversations buzzing with speculation about the audit, about Lila's tone, about the tension they'd sensed but couldn't quite name. I left with Lila walking through the lobby in silence. Outside she turned to me, her face illuminated by the hotel's entrance lights. No words were needed. We both knew what came next. The quiet revenge was no longer quite so quiet. And the reckoning had officially begun. Be warmth. I wore a black dress Lila had sent over, simple and elegant, the kind of armor that said I don't need your approval anymore. Vaughn saw me the moment I walked in. His face flickered, surprise, confusion, then a carefully constructed mask of pleasant indifference. He was across the room with a cluster of clients, Tessa at his elbow playing the perfect protégé. I took a glass of champagne from a passing waiter and found Lila near the silent auction tables. She looked regal in deep burgundy, diamonds at her throat, every inch the executive's wife. You came, she said softly. You knew I would. Yes. She glanced toward Vaughn. He's been watching you since you arrived, trying to figure out why you're here. Let him wonder. The evening moved in slow motion. Courses served, speeches delivered, laughter echoing off crystal chandeliers. I sat at Lila's table surrounded by board members I'd never met, people who smiled politely and asked safe questions about what I was doing now. I told them I was consulting, taking time to heal, moving forward. All true. All carefully edited. Between the main course and dessert, Vaughn approached our table. Lila, he said warmly, bending to kiss her cheek. Beautiful event as always. Thank you, darling. Her voice was honey and broken glass. His eyes slid to me. Elise. What a surprise. I didn't realize you'd be joining us tonight. Lila was kind enough to invite me, I said evenly. Of course. He smiled that perfect smile. It's good to see you looking well. I've been worried about you. The lie hung between us like smoke. That's very thoughtful, I said. A board member, an older woman named Dr. Chen, leaned forward. Elise, didn't you used to work at Mercer and Associates? I did, I said carefully. For 6 years. She was one of our best, Vaughn interjected smoothly. Unfortunately, personal circumstances made it difficult for her to continue. We parted on good terms. Dr. Chen's eyes narrowed slightly, catching something in the air. That's not quite how I remember it, I said quietly. The table went still. Vaughn's smile didn't falter, but something hardened behind his eyes. I think we all have our own perspectives on difficult situations. True. I took a sip of champagne. Though some perspectives are more accurate than others. Lila touched my hand, a gentle warning, but I saw the ghost of approval in her face. Vaughn excused himself, returning to his table with Tessa, who looked between us with growing confusion. That, Dr. Chin said after he left, was interesting. Lila raised her glass. It's about to get more interesting. After dessert, Lila took the stage. The room quieted, all eyes on the woman who'd stood beside Von Mercer for 18 years, smiling through 1,000 events just like this one. Thank you all for being here tonight, she began, her voice carrying effortlessly. Mercer and Associates has grown tremendously this year, and that's thanks to each of you. Our clients, our partners, our team. Polite applause rippled through the room. However, she continued, her tone shifting subtly, growth requires accountability. And accountability requires transparency. I felt the energy in the room shift, a collective holding of breath. Vaughn sat frozen, his smile still in place, but his hand tightened around his glass. Which is why I'm pleased to announce that the board has approved a comprehensive financial audit of all company operations, to ensure we're maintaining the highest ethical standards as we continue to scale. The applause was more uncertain now, people glancing at each other. This audit will be conducted by an independent firm and overseen by our board's ethics committee. We expect full cooperation from all leadership. Her eyes found Vaughn. Full cooperation. He stood, his voice warm but tight. Of course, transparency is essential. I welcomed the audit completely. But his face had gone pale. Lila smiled. I knew you would, darling. After all, she paused, letting the silence build. Family comes first. Isn't that what you always say? The room erupted in applause, but I heard the question underneath it, the first whisper of doubt spreading like cracks through ice. Vaughn's eyes found mine across the crowded ballroom. And for the first time since I'd known him, I saw fear. I raised my glass in a silent toast. The scales were falling. And he could feel it. The break-in happened 3 days after the gala. I came home to find my apartment door slightly ajar, the wood around the lock splintered like broken bones. My heart hammered as I pushed it open slowly, every instinct screaming to run, but something deeper, something angry and tired of running, made me step inside. The place had been searched. Not ransacked, not destroyed, but methodically combed through. Drawers opened and contents shifted. Closet doors left ajar. My laptop was still on the kitchen table, but the papers beside it, copies of my termination letter, my father's insurance documents, were scattered, edges lifting like they'd been photographed. They'd been looking for something specific. My phone rang. Unknown number. I answered without thinking. Silence on the other end. Not empty silence. The kind filled with someone's presence, someone listening, breathing, waiting. Then Vaughn's voice, soft and almost paternal. Elise. I heard about what happened to your apartment. Terrible. The city's not as safe as it used to be. My blood turned to ice. This was you. Pause. When he spoke again, the warmth had evaporated. I don't know what you think you're doing with Lila. But whatever games you're playing, stop. You're in over your head. This isn't about hurt feelings anymore. This is about protecting what I've built. You mean protecting what you've stolen. His laugh was cold, mirthless. You have no idea what you're dealing with. No idea who I know, what resources I have access to. That little recording you made? Inadmissible. You recorded me without consent. And your credibility? Another laugh. You're a fired employee with documented mental health issues who's been harassing her former boss. That's how this looks. That's how it'll always look. My hands shook, but my voice stayed steady. We'll see. No, Elise. Because if you continue down this path, I will destroy whatever's left of your life. Your reputation, your career prospects, your father's legacy. All of it. I will make sure no one ever hires you again. I will make sure everyone knows you're unstable, vindictive, dangerous. The threat hung in the air like smoke. I'm giving you one chance to walk away, he continued, his voice dropping to something almost gentle. Take it. Move on. Find peace. Because if you don't. I hung up. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone. I stood in my violated apartment, surrounded by the evidence of Vaughn's reach, his willingness to cross lines I hadn't even imagined existed. And I realized something that made my chest tighten with a mixture of fear and fury. He was scared. Truly scared. Men who felt secure in their power didn't break into apartments. They didn't make threatening phone calls. They didn't need to. Vaughn Mercer was fracturing. I called Lila immediately. She answered on the first ring, her voice sharp with concern when I told her about the break-in. She instructed me not to touch anything, to call the police, to file a report. Then she said something that made my spine straighten. The break-in proved we were close. Men like Vaughn only lashed out when they felt the walls closing in. His desperation was confirmation that our evidence was devastating enough to warrant this kind of risk. Cornered animals were dangerous. But I needed to be careful now. She was sending someone to stay with me, a private security consultant who worked with the board. No arguments. I started to protest, but she cut me off. This wasn't optional. If something happened to me, if Vaughn managed to intimidate me into silence, everything they'd built would collapse. I was the human face of his cruelty. I was the story that would make people care. I needed to be protected. After we hung up, I stood in my apartment and looked at the scattered papers, the violated space, the clear message Vaughn had sent. He wanted me afraid. He wanted me to understand how powerless I was, how easily he could reach into my life and tear it apart. But standing there in the wreckage, I felt something unexpected. Not fear. Clarity. Because Vaughn had just made a critical mistake. He'd shown his hand. He'd revealed that beneath the polish and the charm and the carefully constructed image of the ethical leader, he was just a bully. A sophisticated one, yes. One with resources and connections and lawyers. But still just a bully. And bullies, I'd learned from my father, only had power if you gave it to them. I walked to my bedroom, pulled out the lockbox I kept under my bed and opened it. Inside was the copy of my father's letter, the insurance policy, and something I hadn't looked at in months. A photo of me and my father from my college graduation. Both of us grinning, his arm around my shoulders, pride radiating from every inch of him. I'd worked 2 jobs to get through school. He'd worked 3. We'd done it together, without help, without shortcuts, without stepping on anyone else to get ahead. That was real power. The kind built on sacrifice and love and showing up even when everything hurt. Vaughn had money and influence and the ability to intimidate. But he'd never had what my father had. He'd never had what I had now. He'd never had nothing to lose. I took the photo, placed it on my nightstand where I could see it every morning, and made a decision. I wasn't walking away. Not now. Not ever. Whatever Vaughn threw at me next, I'd face it. Because this wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about making sure he never did this to anyone else. It was about honor. Not his version, the hollow performance kind, but the real kind. The kind my father had taught me by example every single day of his life. The security consultant arrived an hour later. A woman named Grace, mid-40s, former FBI, with eyes that missed nothing and a calm presence that somehow made my violated apartment feel safer. She swept the space professionally, found 2 cameras, one in the smoke detector, one in the bookshelf, and disabled them with practiced efficiency. Vaughn had been watching me, listening to my conversations with Lila, tracking every move. Grace bagged the cameras as evidence, then turned to me with a look of professional respect. Some people would have crumbled under this kind of pressure, she said. The break-in, the surveillance, the threats. Most people would have walked away. But I was still standing. Still fighting. I told her the truth, I wasn't brave. I was just tired of being afraid. She smiled at that, a small acknowledgement of understanding. Sometimes, she said, those were the same thing. That night, I lay in bed with Grace stationed in my living room, my father's photo watching over me, and thought about Vaughn sitting in his perfect house with his perfect wife and his perfect lies. He thought he'd won tonight. He thought the break-in, the threat, the violation of my space would send me running. But he'd forgotten something crucial. I'd already lost everything that mattered when my father died. There was nothing left for Vaughn to take from me except my dignity and my truth. And those I'd fight for until my last breath. The fracture wasn't in me. It was in him. And it was spreading like cracks through ice, inevitable and irreversible. The coffee shop was deliberately ordinary. A small place in East Atlanta, the kind where freelancers typed on laptops and mothers met for morning playdates, where no one looked twice at two women having a quiet conversation over lattes. I'd arrived early, taken a corner table with a view of the door and waited. Margochin arrived at exactly 9 a.m. She'd been Vaughn's executive assistant for 4 years before I was hired, then moved to a director position at a competing firm. Lila had given me her name 2 nights after the break-in, along with a simple instruction. Listen to her story, then decide if she wanted to tell it publicly. Margot was younger than I expected, maybe 35, with sharp cheekbones and sharper eyes that scanned the coffee shop with practiced caution before landing on me. She ordered an Americano, joined me at the table and got straight to the point. She knew why I'd reached out. Lila had explained the situation. And yes, she was willing to talk, but first she needed to know something. Was I prepared for how ugly this would get? I told her about the break-in, the cameras, Vaughn's threat to destroy whatever was left of my life. I was already in the ugly part, I said. The question was whether I could make it mean something. Margot studied me for a long moment, then began to speak. Her story unfolded like a blueprint of my own destruction, only earlier, crueler, more calculated. Vaughn had hired her straight out of grad school, praised her work ethic, promised mentorship and advancement. For 2 years she'd been perfect, arriving early, staying late, anticipating his needs before he voiced them. Then her mother had gotten sick. Stage 4 lung cancer. Margot had asked for flexible hours to manage doctor's appointments. Vaughn had agreed with what seemed like genuine compassion. But behind her back he'd started the same campaign I'd experienced. Subtle undermining, documentation of minor mistakes, whispers to leadership about reliability concerns. She'd been fired 3 weeks after her mother's funeral. Professional restructuring, they'd called it. Nothing personal. Margot's voice was steady as she told me this, but her hands shook slightly around her coffee cup. She'd spent the last 6 years rebuilding her career, working twice as hard to overcome the reputation Vaughn had carefully constructed for her. And she'd succeeded. But the cost had been enormous. Therapy, lost opportunities, relationships that crumbled under the weight of her constant proving herself. I asked why she was willing to talk now after so much time had passed. She looked at me with something like relief mixed with rage. Because she'd thought she was alone. Thought it was her fault somehow, that she'd deserved it, that she'd failed some test of professional worthiness. But Lila had contacted her a year ago, during the early stages of investigating Vaughn. And Margot had learned she wasn't the first. She wasn't even the second. There were 5 of us. 5 women over 10 years, all following the same pattern. Hired young and hungry. Worked to exhaustion. Hit a moment of human need. Sick parent, health crisis, personal emergency. Then systematically destroyed and discarded. Vaughn's pattern was so precise it could have been a business model. Margot pulled out her phone and showed me a group chat. For other names I didn't recognize, all former employees of Mercer and Associates. The chat was titled The Disposables, Dark Humor as Coping Mechanism. They'd been sharing stories, comparing notes, building a collective memory of Vaughn's cruelty. Each woman had fragments, suspicious financial transactions they'd noticed, client relationships that seemed off, moments when Vaughn's mask had slipped and they'd glimpsed something cold underneath. Individually, the pieces meant little. Together, they formed a mosaic of systematic abuse and likely fraud. I asked if they'd be willing to go on record, to tell their stories publicly when the time came. Margot's smile was grim. They'd been waiting for someone to ask. All 5 of them. They'd been waiting for someone brave enough or angry enough or broken enough to stand up first. And now I was that person. She asked if I understood what would happen when we went public. The media attention, the scrutiny, the way Vaughn would use every resource to discredit us. He'd call us disgruntled employees, bitter failures, women who couldn't handle professional pressure. He'd dig into our lives, find every mistake, every vulnerability, every moment of human weakness and weaponize it. I thought about my father, about his final words, about the way Vaughn had timed my termination to land while my father's heart was giving out. I thought about the break-in, the threats, the cameras in my apartment. I told Margot I understood. And I was ready. She nodded slowly, then reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Welcome to the Whisper Network," she said. "We've been waiting for you." Over the next hour, Margot laid out what they knew. Financial irregularities that went back years. Ghost employees on payroll whose salaries went to offshore accounts. Client billing that didn't match services rendered. A pattern of hiring young women, working them to collapse, then replacing them before they could see enough to become dangerous. But the smoking gun was something Margot had kept for 6 years, too afraid to use, too angry to destroy. An email thread between Vaughn and a board member, sent 2 weeks before she was fired. In it, Vaughn discussed her mother's illness and the liability it created. He'd written that employees who brought excessive personal drama into the workplace needed to be phased out before they became toxic influences on company culture. The board member had agreed. Had used the phrase addition by subtraction. They discussed her termination like she was a malfunctioning piece of equipment, not a human being watching her mother die. Margot's voice finally cracked when she showed me that email. 6 years of composed silence breaking open, revealing the wound that had never quite healed. I read it 3 times, each word sharper than the last. Then I looked up at her and said what needed to be said. This wasn't her fault. None of it. Vaughn was the architect of cruelty, and everyone who'd enabled him shared the guilt. She wiped her eyes quickly, professionally, the way you learn to cry when you can't afford to be seen crying. Then she pulled herself together and asked the question I'd been waiting for. What happened next? I told her about Lila's audit, about the board votes already secured, about the evidence compiled over 2 years. We were building a case that would expose Vaughn's financial fraud and his systematic abuse of employees. But we needed the human stories to make it real. Numbers were abstract. Women's lives destroyed were undeniable. Margot agreed to testify. She'd connect me with the others in the group chat. They'd all testify too if it meant stopping Vaughn from doing this to someone else. We finished our coffee in a silence that felt sacred somehow. 2 women who'd been broken by the same machine, now working together to dismantle it. Before leaving, Margot said something that stayed with me. She'd spent 6 years thinking she should have fought back immediately. But now she understood that wasn't how it worked. You couldn't fight back when you were still drowning. You had to survive first, reach the shore, catch your breath. And then, only then, could you turn around and burn down the thing that tried to kill you. I walked back to my car with a new weight in my chest. Not burden. Responsibility. 5 women's stories. 6 counting mine. A decade of systematic cruelty. All leading to this moment. The Whisper Network wasn't whispering anymore. It was about to scream. Lila's call came at midnight. Her voice was different this time, tighter, more urgent. She needed to see me immediately. Not tomorrow. No. Her home. Come alone. I drove through empty Atlanta streets with Grace following in a separate car, security protocol that had become routine since the break-in. Lila's house was in Buckhead, one of those estates hidden behind gates and walls and carefully manicured privacy. The front door opened before I reached it. Lila stood in the entrance, and for the first time since I'd met her, she looked truly shaken. Not scared. Something deeper. Like a person who just discovered the foundation of her house had been built on sand. She led me to her study, all dark wood and leather chairs, a space that smelled like old books and older money. She poured 2 glasses of whiskey without asking, handed me one and drank hers in a single swallow. Then she told me what she'd found. The offshore accounts weren't just Vaughn's embezzlement. They were also his escape plan. He'd been moving money systematically for 3 years, building a financial cushion in the Cayman Islands. Enough to disappear if things ever went bad. Enough to start over somewhere else with a new identity if necessary. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the insurance policy. Vaughn had taken out a life insurance policy on Lila 2 years ago. $5 million with him as the sole beneficiary. She'd signed paperwork she thought was related to estate planning, trusting him because that's what 18 years of marriage had taught her to do. Now, looking at the documents her investigator had uncovered, she understood what she'd really signed. Vaughn had been planning multiple exit strategies. Embezzle and run. Or, if that became too complicated, ensure Lila met with an unfortunate accident and collect. The words hung between us like poison gas. I set down my whiskey, my hand trembling. This wasn't just corporate fraud anymore. This wasn't just systematic abuse of employees. This was something darker, more primal, more dangerous. Lila's voice was eerily calm when she continued. She'd hired a security team that morning. Former Secret Service. They'd already swept her house for any signs of tampering, gas leaks, faulty wiring, anything that could be staged as an accident. They'd found an issue with her car's brake lines. Professionally done, almost invisible, discovered only because they'd been specifically looking. Someone had tried to kill her. And there was only one person with motive. My blood turned to ice. I asked if she'd gone to the police. She gave me a look that said I was being naive. With Vaughn's connections, his lawyers, his carefully constructed reputation, any accusation would be spun as a vindictive wife in a bitter divorce. The brake lines could be explained as normal wear. The insurance policy as prudent planning. She had suspicions, not proof. And suspicions didn't stop men like Vaughn. So she'd done what powerful women had always done when the system failed them. She'd made her own plan. The audit was moving forward, scheduled for next week. But Lila had accelerated the timeline. She was filing for divorce simultaneously, with a forensic accountant already prepared to testify about Vaughn's hidden assets. She was also going to the media. Not tabloids, but serious investigative journalists who'd been cultivating sources inside Mercer and Associates for months. The story would break in 3 days. All of it. The embezzlement, the pattern of abuse toward employees, the offshore accounts, the suspicious insurance policy. Everything. But she needed one more thing from me. She needed me to give an on-camera interview. To be the face of Vaughn's cruelty. To tell my story. My father's death, Vaughn's termination email, the systematic destruction of my career and reputation, with my name and face attached. Because numbers and financial documents wouldn't move people. But a daughter who lost everything while her father was dying? That would move mountains. I stared at my untouched whiskey, feeling the weight of what she was asking. Going public meant giving up any chance of anonymity. It meant opening myself to scrutiny, to judgment, to Vaughn's inevitable counterattack. It meant reliving the worst moments of my life in front of cameras and strangers and an internet that would dissect every word, every tear, every moment of vulnerability. But it also meant other women would see themselves in my story. It meant Vaughn couldn't hurt anyone else. It meant my father's death wouldn't be meaningless, reduced to a footnote in my former boss's carefully crafted narrative of corporate success. I thought about my father working 3 jobs to get me through college. About him squeezing my hand in that hospital bed, telling me not to let them own me. About Vaughn's voice on the phone, threatening to destroy whatever was left of my life. I looked up at Lila and told her yes. Her eyes filled with something I'd rarely seen in her, gratitude mixed with guilt. She knew what this would cost me. She knew I was sacrificing privacy and peace for justice that might not even come. But I wasn't doing it for justice anymore. I was doing it for every woman who'd been told her grief made her unreliable. For every person who'd been gaslit into believing their humanity was a professional failing. For every child who'd watched a parent work themselves to death only to see that sacrifice weaponized against them. Lila poured us both another whiskey. This time I drank mine. She told me about the journalist, a woman named Rebecca Walsh who'd broken corporate corruption stories before. Rebecca had already interviewed 2 of the other women from the Whisper Network. She wanted to meet with me tomorrow to prep for the on-camera interview. The story would air in 3 days, same day the audit was announced. Coordinated timing to maximize impact. Vaughn would wake up to his world collapsing on multiple fronts simultaneously. Divorce papers, fraud investigation, media exposure, public testimony from 6 women he'd destroyed. He'd have no time to spin the narrative, to call in favors, to intimidate us into silence. By the time he understood what was happening, it would be too late. I asked Lila why she was doing this. After 18 years of marriage, she could have just divorced him quietly, taken her half, moved on. Why risk everything for a public takedown? Her answer was simple and devastating. Because for 18 years she'd enabled him. She'd turned a blind eye to the whispers, the employee turnover, the way he talked about people like they were assets to be managed rather than humans to be respected. She'd benefited from his success while other women paid the price. She couldn't undo that. But she could make sure it ended with her. The pact between us was unspoken but absolute. 2 women who'd been broken by the same man in different ways, now working together to ensure he never broke anyone else. Before I left, Lila showed me one more thing, a locked drawer in her desk. Inside was a file labeled "For After." Insurance policies, custody documents, a new will, instructions for her lawyers. Contingencies in case Vaughn got desperate enough to try again. She was prepared to die to stop him. I looked at this woman, wealthy, powerful, connected, and saw myself reflected back. We were the same. Both of us had learned too late that the men we trusted were monsters. Both of us were now willing to risk everything to expose the truth. I drove home with Grace following, the weight of the interview pressing against my chest like a stone. In 3 days I would sit in front of cameras and tell the world what Vaughn Mercer had done. I would cry on television. I would expose my pain and my father's death and every moment of manipulation I'd endured. And Vaughn would watch it happen, powerless to stop it, finally understanding what it felt like to be destroyed by someone you'd underestimated. The pact was made. The timeline was set. The reckoning was 3 days away. The boardroom was designed to intimidate. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Atlanta's skyline. A table that could seat 20, polished to reflect the faces of everyone who sat around it. Leather chairs that cost more than my father had made in a year. Everything about the space screamed power, permanence, inevitability. But today it felt like a courtroom. I sat beside Lila, facing the board of Mercer and Associates. 11 people total. 7 men, 4 women, all watching me with expressions ranging from curiosity to skepticism to carefully masked hostility. Vaughn sat at the head of the table, his face a masterpiece of controlled concern, like a man forced to deal with an unpleasant but minor inconvenience. He didn't know yet. Didn't know about Rebecca Walsh's story going live in 2 hours. Didn't know about the 5 other women who'd given interviews. Didn't know that while he sat here performing concern, his entire empire was about to collapse like a building whose foundation had been secretly removed. The meeting was ostensibly about the audit findings. The independent firm had worked with unprecedented speed. Lila's doing, board members she'd carefully cultivated over 2 years, all pushing for rapid resolution. The lead auditor, a woman in her 60s named Patricia Grant, stood at the front of the room with a presentation remote in her hand. She clicked to the first slide. Financial irregularities. Summary of findings. What followed was a systematic dismantling of Vaughn Mercer's carefully constructed house of cards. Ghost employees whose salaries went to offshore accounts. Client billing that exceeded documented work hours by thousands. Consulting fees paid to shell corporations that didn't exist. A decade of embezzlement disguised as operating expenses, all signed off by Vaughn, all benefiting Vaughn, all traceable back to accounts he controlled. The numbers on the screen were devastating. Over $4 million, moved systematically over 10 years. Vaughn's face remained composed, but I saw his jaw tighten, a muscle jumping beneath his skin. One of the board members, Dr. Chin, who'd been at the gala, asked the question everyone was thinking. How had this gone undetected for so long? Patricia's answer was damning in its simplicity. The person responsible for oversight was the same person committing the fraud. Vaughn had positioned himself to review his own transactions, creating a closed loop where no one questioned his authority. It was, Patricia said with professional detachment, one of the most sophisticated embezzlement schemes she'd encountered in 30 years of forensic accounting. Another board member asked about criminal implications. Patricia deferred to the board's legal counsel, who stood and delivered the verdict. Based on these findings, they were legally obligated to report to federal authorities. The FBI's white-collar crime division would be notified within the hour. The room went completely silent. Vaughn finally spoke, his voice still calm but edged with something sharp. These accusations were serious and required thorough investigation, he agreed. But they were also premature. Numbers could be misinterpreted. Transactions taken out of context. He welcomed full scrutiny, of course, but expected due process and the presumption of innocence until proven otherwise. It was a good performance. If I hadn't heard that recording, hadn't seen the real Vaughn beneath the mask, I might have believed him. But Lila had been waiting for this moment. She stood, her voice cutting through Vaughn's carefully constructed defense like a scalpel through tissue. The board should know, she said, that she was filing for divorce this morning. The papers were already submitted. And as part of the divorce proceedings, she'd be providing testimony about additional offshore accounts her investigators had discovered, accounts not yet included in the audit. Vaughn's mask finally cracked. His face went pale, eyes widening with something between rage and panic. She continued, relentless. The board should also know about a life insurance policy Vaughn had taken out on her 2 years ago without her knowledge. About the suspicious brake line failure her security team had discovered last week. About the pattern of escalating behavior that suggested Vaughn had been planning multiple exit strategies. One of the board members interrupted, asking what she was implying. Lila's answer was quiet but devastating. She was implying that Vaughn Mercer was not just a thief but potentially dangerous. That employees and family members who got in his way had reason to fear for their safety. Vaughn exploded out of his chair, his voice rising for the first time. This was character assassination, he said. A vindictive spouse in a bitter divorce, aided by a disgruntled former employee who'd been terminated for legitimate performance reasons. This entire meeting was a setup, a coordinated attack by people with personal grudges. He turned to me, his voice dropping to something almost pleading. He tried to help me, he said. After my father died, he'd done everything possible to accommodate my grief. But I'd been unable to perform my duties, had made mistakes that jeopardized client relationships. The termination had been painful but necessary. I felt every eye in the room turn to me, waiting. This was the moment. The choice between silence and speaking. Between accepting his narrative or telling the truth. I stood slowly, my legs steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. I addressed the board directly, my voice quiet but clear. Vaughn was right about one thing. I had been terminated. But the timing of that termination, I said, was something they should know. I told them about my father's final night. About the hospital. About holding his hand as his heart monitor flatlined at 2:47 a.m. And about the termination email that arrived at 2:44 a.m., 3 minutes before my father's death. The room went absolutely silent. I continued, my voice steady. Vaughn had fired me while my father was dying. Not after. During. One of the board members looked at Vaughn, then back at me, horror dawning on his face. But that wasn't even the most damaging part, I said. I pulled out my phone and set it on the conference table, screen facing up. On it was the audio file from Chapter 7. The board meeting from 2 months before my father's death, where Vaughn had discussed my performance issues and planned my termination. I pressed play. Vaughn's voice filled the boardroom, warm and confident, discussing me like I was a problem to be managed rather than a person in pain. The recording played for 90 seconds, long enough to be damning, short enough to hold everyone's attention. When it ended, I looked directly at Vaughn. He'd planned my termination months before my father died, I said. The night my father passed wasn't a difficult business decision made in crisis. It was the execution of a plan he'd been building for months. He'd weaponized my father's illness against me, documented every moment I'd struggled to care for a dying parent, and used it to justify destroying my career. And I wasn't the only one. I gestured to Lila, who pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. Inside were statements from 5 other women, all former employees, all following the same pattern. Personal crisis, systematic undermining, eventual termination, reputation destroyed. A decade of doing this to women who trusted him. Dr. Chin picked up the folder, her hands trembling slightly as she read. Vaughn tried to speak, but Lila cut him off. The media story goes live in 90 minutes, she said. 6 women interviewed on camera about their experiences working for Vaughn. Financial documents. Timeline of his embezzlement. Everything. By noon, she said, this boardroom and everyone in it will be under national scrutiny. The question is whether this board takes action now, or explains to federal investigators and journalists why they protected a man with this much evidence against him. The room erupted into overlapping conversations, board members arguing, lawyers conferring urgently, voices rising in panic and recrimination. Through it all, Vaughn sat frozen, his perfect mask finally shattered, revealing the frightened, desperate man underneath. I caught his eye across the table. For 6 years I'd looked up to him, respected him, believed his words about family and loyalty and showing up for each other. But now, finally, I saw him clearly. He was just a bully. A sophisticated one, yes. One with money and power and connections. But still just a bully. And bullies, my father had taught me, only had the power you gave them. I was done giving Vaughn Mercer anything. The board voted 15 minutes later. Unanimous decision. Vaughn Mercer was suspended immediately, pending investigation. All financial authorities would be frozen. Security would escort him from the building. The board would cooperate fully with federal investigators. As security approached to walk him out, Vaughn looked at me one final time. His expression was pure hatred. But I also saw something else underneath. Respect. Just a flicker, quickly buried but unmistakable. He'd underestimated me. Dismissed me as weak, emotional, disposable. And that miscalculation had cost him everything. I watched him leave, escorted like a criminal, his perfect suit and perfect hair and perfect reputation all crumbling like sand castles at high tide. Lila touched my arm gently. It was over, she said. Really over. But standing in that boardroom, surrounded by the wreckage of Vaughn Mercer's empire, I realized something. It wasn't over. This was just the beginning. The beginning of other women feeling safe enough to tell their stories. The beginning of real accountability for men who treated employees as disposable. The beginning of a system that might finally start to change. My father wouldn't be proud of the revenge. But he'd be proud that I'd stood up. That I'd refused to be owned. That I'd turned my pain into purpose. That I thought was worth every moment of fear and violation and trauma. The reckoning had come. And it had been absolute. The cemetery was empty at 6 a.m. I'd been coming here every morning for the past week, watching the sun rise over my father's grave, trying to find words for feelings too big for language. The media storm had been exactly what Lila predicted, brutal and unrelenting. Rebecca Walsh's story had gone viral within hours, picked up by every major news outlet, dissected and discussed and debated across social media. My face was everywhere. My story was everywhere. The six of us had become a symbol, our pain transformed into hashtags and headlines and think pieces about corporate culture and toxic masculinity and the cost of speaking truth. Vaughn had been arrested the day after the board meeting. Federal charges: wire fraud, embezzlement, obstruction of justice. His lawyers were already spinning the narrative, calling it a witch hunt, claiming the evidence was circumstantial, painting him as a successful man targeted by vindictive women. But the evidence was overwhelming. The offshore accounts, the recordings, the testimony from 6 women whose stories aligned too perfectly to be dismissed as coincidence. He would go to trial. He would probably go to prison. And part of me felt nothing. No satisfaction. No relief. Just emptiness where rage used to be. I knelt beside my father's headstone, the grass damp with morning dew, and pulled out the letter I'd been carrying since he died. His handwriting, shaky but clear, his final words to me. Don't give your life to people who wouldn't give you a minute. I'd read it 100 times. 1,000. But this morning, kneeling in the wet grass with the sun breaking over the horizon, I finally understood what he'd really been telling me. It wasn't about Vaughn. It was never about Vaughn. It was about me. About choosing myself. About understanding that my worth wasn't determined by people who'd treated me as disposable. About knowing that grief and love and showing up for the people who mattered. Those weren't weaknesses. They were the entire point. I traced my fingers over his name carved into granite. Robert James Harper. Beloved father. The stone didn't say anything about the 3 jobs or the midnight shifts or the way he'd worked himself to exhaustion so I could have opportunities he'd never had. But I remembered. And that memory was more permanent than any engraving. A voice spoke softly behind me. I thought I might find you here. I turned to find Lila standing a respectful distance away, dressed simply in jeans and a coat, looking more human than I'd ever seen her. The past week had stripped away her corporate armor too. The divorce was proceeding. She'd resigned from all Vaughn's boards, stepped down from social committees, withdrawn from the world that had defined her for 18 years. She was rebuilding, same as me. I gestured for her to join me, and she knelt beside me in the grass, not caring about the dew soaking through expensive denim. We sat in silence for a long moment, 2 women who'd been broken by the same man, now bound together by something stronger than shared trauma. Understanding. Recognition. The quiet knowledge that we'd survived something that was meant to destroy us. I wanted to thank you, Lila said finally, for being brave enough to go first. For standing up when you had every reason to walk away. I shook my head. You gave me the platform. You built the case. You risked your life. We both did what we had to do. She paused, looking at my father's grave. Would he be proud? The question hit me harder than expected. I thought about my father's values. Kindness, hard work, integrity, protecting people weaker than yourself. Revenge wasn't on that list. Neither was public destruction of enemies. But standing up to bullies was. Protecting others from harm was. Refusing to let cruelty go unchallenged was. I think so, I said softly. Not because of what we did to Vaughn, but because we stopped him from doing it to anyone else. Lila nodded, understanding the distinction. 5 more women have come forward since the story broke. Women from other companies where Vaughn consulted, women from boards he sat on. The pattern goes back further than we knew. My chest tightened. More victims. More lives damaged. The scope of his cruelty was even larger than we'd documented. They're pressing additional charges, Lila continued. The DA thinks the evidence is strong enough to put him away for 15 to 20 years. 15 to 20 years. A lifetime in prison for a man who'd built his identity on power and control and image. I waited to feel satisfaction. Vindication. Victory. Dad, I felt tired. So deeply tired. Does it ever feel like enough? I asked. Lila was quiet for a long moment. No, she admitted. Because nothing can undo what he did. Nothing can give those years back or restore those reputations or bring back your father. She looked at me with eyes that had seen too much. But it has to be enough anyway. Because it's all we have. He was right. Justice was imperfect, insufficient, always arriving too late. But it was still justice. And for the women who came after us, it would mean something. It would mean they weren't alone. It would mean someone had fought back and won. I pulled out a small box I'd brought with me, matches and my father's letter. Lila watched as I carefully unfolded the paper one last time, reading his words in the soft morning light. The insurance isn't for them. It's for you to walk away clean. He'd given me the means to escape, to rebuild, to be free. And I'd used it not to run but to fight. I struck a match, the flame bright against the gray dawn, and held it to the corner of the letter. The paper caught slowly, curling and blackening, my father's handwriting disappearing into ash. But I didn't need the letter anymore. I'd memorized every word. More importantly, I'd learned the lesson behind them. Freedom wasn't about running away from the things that hurt you. It was about refusing to let them own you. It was about standing in the fire and coming out transformed rather than destroyed. I watched the last of the letter burn, the ashes scattering in the morning breeze like seeds. Lila stood offering me her hand. I took it, pulling myself up from the wet grass. What happens now? I asked. She smiled, small and genuine. We live. Really live. Not performing for anyone, not proving anything. Just being. Sounded simple. Sounded impossible. Sounded exactly right. We walked together toward the cemetery gates, leaving my father's grave behind but carrying his love with us. The sun was fully up now, burning away the morning mist, promising a day of clarity and light. Behind us one chapter ended. Ahead of us another began. I didn't know what that chapter would hold. Probably therapy. Definitely uncertainty. Job searching, rebuilding, explaining this period of my life to skeptical interviewers who'd Google my name and find 1,000 articles about corporate revenge and public takedowns. But I'd face it without fear. Without shame. Without the weight of Vaughn Mercer's lies pulling me under. I'd face it free. And that, I thought, was worth everything it had cost to get here. The cemetery gates closed behind us with a soft metallic click. I didn't look back. 6 months later, I hung my father's photograph in my new office. It was a small space, just a room in my apartment, really, converted with a desk and proper lighting and a view of the trees outside. But it was mine. No glass walls. No performance metrics. No one watching to document my humanity as professional failure. The consulting work had started slowly. A referral from Margot, then another from one of the women in the Whisper network. Word spread quietly through networks of women who'd been burned by corporate machines. Women who needed someone who understood the cost of speaking truth. Someone who wouldn't gaslight them into doubting their own experiences. I specialized in workplace culture assessments, helping companies identify toxic patterns before they became disasters. It was good work. Meaningful work. The kind that let me sleep at night. Lila called every week. She'd started a foundation focused on employee advocacy and corporate accountability. 3 of the other women from our case worked with her now. They were building something real from the wreckage. A network that protected vulnerable employees, documented patterns of abuse, provided legal support for people going up against powerful bosses. They'd asked me to join the board. I'd said yes. Vaughn's trial had ended 2 months ago. Guilty on 14 counts. 23 years in federal prison. His appeals were already in motion, his lawyers arguing technicalities and procedural errors, but the convictions stood. I'd attended every day of the trial, sitting in the back row with Lila and the others. A quiet presence that said, we're still here, we're still watching, we're still standing. Vaughn had looked older on the witness stand. Smaller. The polish was gone, replaced by the desperate energy of a man watching his entire identity crumble. He'd stuck to his narrative, misunderstanding, misinterpretation, vindictive women with axes to grind. The jury hadn't believed him. Neither had the judge, who delivered the sentence with barely concealed contempt. When it was over, when the bailiffs led Vaughn away in handcuffs, I'd waited to feel something. Victory. Closure. Peace. Instead I felt nothing. And that, I'd realized, was its own kind of freedom. He didn't matter anymore. Not to me. Not to my life. He was just a man in prison, stripped of the power he'd spent decades accumulating, facing the consequences of his own cruelty. What mattered was what came after. A knock on my office door pulled me from memory. Grace stood in the doorway. She'd become a friend rather than security, though she still checked in regularly. "You ready for your 3 o'clock?" she asked. I glanced at my calendar. A new client. Young woman, 26, forced out of her job after reporting harassment. Wanted advice on next steps. The story was familiar. Painfully so. But this time she wouldn't face it alone. I stood, straightening my father's photo one last time, and turned to Grace with a small smile. Ready. The work was never done. There would always be more Vaughns, more systems designed to protect powerful men at the expense of vulnerable employees, more women who needed someone to believe them when they said something was wrong. But there would also be more of us. More women refusing to stay silent. More allies willing to risk comfort for justice. More people who understood that real change happened not through single heroic moments, but through the daily, unglamorous work of showing up and pushing back and refusing to let cruelty become normal. My phone buzzed. A text from Margot. "New referral for you. Woman in tech. Same pattern as yours. Interested?" I typed back. Always. Send her info. Because this was the work now. Not revenge. Not even justice, really. Connection. Support. The quiet certainty that no one had to face these battles alone. I thought about Vaughn's favorite phrase, "Family comes first." He'd weaponized it, turned it into a trap, used it to demand loyalty while offering none in return. But sitting in my quiet office with my father's photo watching over me, with a network of women who'd survived and were now helping others survive, I realized something. He'd been right about one thing. Family did come first. Real family. The kind you built from shared pain and mutual respect and the decision to show up for each other when it mattered. That family. The whisper network that had become a shout. The women who'd stood together when standing alone would have meant destruction. That was worth everything. The doorbell rang. My 3 o'clock arriving early. I took a breath, centered myself, and walked to greet her. Another woman with another story of betrayal and manipulation and systematic cruelty disguised as professionalism. Another woman who deserved to be believed. To be supported. To know that her pain was valid and her anger was justified and her decision to fight back was brave. I opened the door and she looked at me with eyes that were trying so hard to stay composed, trying so hard not to break. I recognized that look. I'd worn it myself not so long ago. "Come in," I said gently. "You're safe here." She stepped inside and I closed the door on the world outside. The one that had tried to break both of us, the one we were now working to change. The afternoon sun streamed through my office window, catching my father's photograph, making it glow like a promise kept. "Don't let them own you." I hadn't. And I'd make sure she didn't either. The quiet room filled with her story, with her pain, with her decision to stand up. And in that moment I understood what my father had really given me. Not just the means to escape. The courage to stay and fight. The wisdom to know the difference. And the certainty that sometimes the strongest revenge wasn't winning. It was never letting them matter again. The envelope arrived on the first anniversary of my father's death. Plain manila. No return address, hand-delivered to my building. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 4 words written in careful script. "Thank you for fighting." No signature. No explanation needed. Another woman. Another survivor. Another person who'd seen our story and found the courage to tell her own. I pinned it to the wall beside my father's photo, the first in what would become a collection. Evidence that pain shared could become power multiplied. That standing up mattered. That no act of courage, no matter how small or quiet or imperfect, was ever wasted. Outside my window, Atlanta hummed with its usual chaos. But up here in this quiet room there was peace. Not the kind that came from forgetting. The kind that came from finally, truly being free.